Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior AP English, and our objective today is to begin a conversation which will continue through tomorrow, particularly over Chaucer, Middle English, and, of course, the great Canterbury Tales. Our objective now is of three parts. You may want to jot this down right away. One, we want to introduce what we will call Chaucer's project. All right, for lack of a better term, we're going to call it Chaucer's project. Subsumed in that conversation will be an understanding of satire. It makes some sense that we would finish with 20th century satire, Monty Python's Holy Grail, and then begin to ask the question, at what point in the history of literature does Monty Python's Holy Grail as a license be prescribed? That is to say, how can you take something so sacred as the King Arthur motif and turn it into something so satiric? By the way, there are other, of course, John Cleese offerings. Life of Brian, for example, is the rendering of the life of Jesus Christ. More than a few found that less than acceptable satire, as you can imagine. Where does it all start? Well, we're not going to say that it starts with Chaucer. We're going to say that it starts with Chaucer. And so that's the first thing, okay? And obviously I'm speaking in hyperbole as I say it. Two, we're going to take a look at Chaucer's offering his Canterbury Tales, and more particularly the general prologue, as we will call it. Finally, three, we will begin to set up our study of two, and only two, of the tales of Canterbury Tales. The majority of the tales of Canterbury Tales I couldn't teach in a public high school. I can only teach them in a university setting because they are very questionable material. Most of you would consider them beyond belief obscene. So let's begin though with the first of those three. All right. So we're going to start now with the notion of satire and Chaucer's project. We're going to call Chaucer the father of the English language. Now, let's just get this out of the way real quickly. You can't hardly give a more important single name to a writer than to call that writer the father of the language. So that immediately, let's just say this for our notes, when I and other scholars call Chaucer the father of the English language, we are immediately giving Chaucer preeminence above Shakespeare, above Byron Shelley Keats, and above any other important writer or poet of the English tradition. Wow, that's a big dog deal, especially since a number of you will say, I've heard of Shakespeare, but Chaucer, I guess I really never even heard much of that other than maybe the name once or something like that. Why is he so important? That'll be important in our conversation. We also have to talk about Chaucer's project, as I mentioned it a second ago. Chaucer's project, and that begins with a bit of biography, so let's start there. The working date for Chaucer, and I like round dates, but the working date for Chaucer, and you can see full dates there on page 138. The working date for Chaucer that I like is, you can pick two, because there's two easy ones, 1350 or 1400. 1400 works rather nicely. If, for example, you want to say that Beowulf is 1000 Common Era, and Beowulf represents Old English, then we will qualify 400 years later the English of Chaucer as Middle English. And that's what we'll call this. That little handout that I gave to you, by the way, is an example of Middle English, and we'll get to that one in a moment and why that's such an important page for you in your notes. It's significant to point out that short of special classes on Chaucer in an English department that you would take because you're insane enough to major in English at the university, you're normally not going to be exposed to Chaucer at the university level. Chaucer is usually assumed to be taught at the senior year of high school in America. So in your honors programs, sadly, most of you will not really be taught much Chaucer. It's not going to be introduced much to you. The assumption will be you've seen it, you've done it. So let's talk about who is this Chaucer cat. Well, the first thing we want to point out about him is that he is born in the perfect time and place to be the Chaucer that he becomes. Ultimately, and I can't get into all the details, you can read the biography if you want, but ultimately, Chaucer ends up as an ambassador. That is to say, he travels Europe. What's significant about that is a couple of things. He learns multiple languages and cultures, but most importantly, he shows up in Italy. Where as he gets off of the boat, people are talking about two important writers. Of course, Dante is already being mentioned, yes, but two important writers beyond Dante. Petrarch, who is going to be an Italian sonneteer, a guy who writes sonnets, but more particularly, and for our discussion, really important, the name Boccaccio is kicked around. Now, who is Boccaccio? Boccaccio, of course, is the writer of the classic text, the Decameron. Now, you already know about Boccaccio if you've read Federico's Falcon, because Federico's Falcon is one of the stories from Boccaccio's collection of stories called Decameron. Deca, of course, means 10. The way Boccaccio, by the way, sets this up is he says, there's this terrible plague that happens, and so to save themselves, a group of young Italian guys and girls, all under the age of 25, run to stay in this little farm outside of one of the cities, where they quarantine themselves. That is to say, they let nobody in, let nobody out. And of course, they're Italians, which means that only after a few hours they grow bored of whatever it is Italian boys and girls do together. We'll not get into that. And they decide that as a form of a contest, they will tell stories. Which story is the best story will win some kind of prize. Now, Boccaccio is making all of this up. But what it allows him to do is to tell his story through the mouthpiece of another person. So, for example, Federico's Falcon is a story told, yes, written by Boccaccio, but actually told through the mouth of another person. The advantage is here, we'll talk about when we talk about Chaucer at the end of the general prologue. We'll understand why would anyone want to do that? Why wouldn't Boccaccio just tell the story of what actually is happening up there in that tree in one of those stories that has to be labeled today as beyond obscene? And the answer is for Boccaccio, well, it wasn't me. I'm just telling you a story that I heard was told. In other words, he has a bit of distance, okay, because he knows that some of what he's going to do is going to get him in trouble. The other really important thing about Boccaccio is he follows Dante and he writes in the Italian of the masses. He writes in the language of the street person. So that, for example, he can begin to create, Boccaccio, can begin to create a bestseller. People actually will read this. The Italians read this. Chaucer's influenced by this text. He's influenced by the choice of the language that can be written. And then he returns back to London, where he takes a job working basically as a gatekeeper for one of the major gates of London. In the process of doing this, he also begins to invent an idea. Much like Boccaccio, he's going to tell a series of stories. He'll call them tales. And these stories will be told by a group of pilgrims who are journeying to a town called Canterbury. Canterbury is outside of London. It has become a holy site. Now, what does that mean? Well, Canterbury is a very religious town for two reasons. One, it has a beautiful cathedral there with a history. A famous man named Thomas Becket, before Chaucer, Thomas Becket, a famous priest, was killed in the church. And because of that, the church becomes a very holy site in England because people consider Becket a very important saint. Now, right away, the economy of Canterbury figures it out. All we have to do now is to invite people to come on pilgrimage to the grave of Thomas Becket. We can charge them money to walk in front of the grave, and they will believe that if they touch the grave or whatever, that their problems are all taken care of and their illnesses are all healed. You see all of this kind of thing. Canterbury has kind of grown up then as an economy that is sustained in the springtime when people go on pilgrimage down to Canterbury from London. Okay? So what Chaucer will do in his project is he wants to tell stories. He's going to invent. That's an important verb for your notes. He invents. He makes this up. He will invent a entourage, the French word for group of travelers, a group. He invents this group. He will make this group very diverse. Okay? There's kind of three groups that are represented in the entourage. And these are important for our notes. The first will be the group of religious, as we will call them, those individuals who are affiliated with the church. The second group will be that group that we would qualify as the upper class, those of some means and power. And then finally, the third group would be what we would call middle to lower class individuals, those who have to work for a living, if you will. Okay? Now, this entourage is going to meet up, we're going to be told, at a special place. We'll get to it in a moment. And then Chaucer will be invited to go along. And to that degree, Chaucer is himself like a CNN journalist. He's making all this up, where he basically says, I was invited to go along on this journey, so I went. And because it's a long walk, some who have wealth can ride, but at a slow pace, to Canterbury, we basically had to stop, pull over to the side of the road. One individual would step up, introduce himself or herself, and then tell a story. Chaucer is just writing these stories. This was his project. Sadly, he dies, we think about 1400, before he's able to complete the entire project. But a good number of these stories he does complete. Okay? It's called Canterbury Tales, because of course they were headed towards Canterbury. Right away though, Chaucer had a major decision, and this is why we'll call him the father of the English language. Chaucer has a major decision. What language will he write in? Now here's the thing. Let's imagine for a moment that Mr. Batson woke up this morning and for some reason he was just driven to know what the people in England of 1350 were really like. I mean, he's driven. He wants to know this. This is possible, given Mr. Batson's desires for information, knowledge. And so he goes to the airport. He jumps on a plane. He flies to Washington, D.C. He takes a taxi cab to the greatest library in the world, the Library of Congress. He walks in and he says, I really want to know what the people of England in 1350 were like. What can I read to tell me that? And the circulation agent will say, not much. We really don't have a lot. The first group of people who write about this are religious, but they all write in Latin, to which Mr. Batson says, no worries, I have a PhD in biblical studies, I can study and read in Latin, give me the material. And as he starts to read what the church people have to say about these English people of 1350, there's really only two things that they say. One, they smell. They smell. They don't take baths. They refuse to take baths. In fact, there are rumors that if you ever take a bath, you will wipe off the covering of, we would call it dirt, right? Filth on your body, and in so doing, you get sick and you die. There are stories of adult men and women who do not bathe for over 10 years. They do not bathe. They stink. Worse than that, they have no plumbing system. So they poop in a pail, they take the pail and they throw it out into the front street, where they happen to also send their children to go and play. Of course, we today will know that there's this thing called the plague, and we're pretty certain that a big problem and reason for the plague was the lack of hygiene of these people. They stink. The church fathers say, oh yeah, one other thing for Mr. Batson. All they do is hanky panky. This group of people, they are hanky pankying like rabbits all the time. The church fathers say, we preach against it, we make them feel guilty about it. It does not matter. This is all they ever want to do. They are completely enveloped in sin, and we preach against it. It doesn't matter. That's these people. They are disgustingly smelly, and they have no morals to speak of. End of story. Well, Mr. Batson comes back to the circulation agent and says, look, I kind of have a sense that there's probably more to these people in 1350 than this. Got anybody else I can read? To which the circulation will say, well, they're the French, who at the time are actually the ones kind of in control. And Batson says, no worries, I've studied at the Sorbonne, I'm fluent in French, give me this information. And so he's reading about, what the French have to say. French basically say two things. One, they stink. They stink. They stink even when they talk. The French will say they speak a strange guttural dialect that sounds kind of like German. It is a hybrid language that is predominantly spoken, and the French report it's spoken in the economic districts when the French are around. That is to say, if you want to kind of fool the French, you speak in this language that will be termed English. It is a hybrid kind of language, and it's disgusting when it's spoken. Now, for those of you that ever sat at an airport and listened to, for example, the French language being spoken, and your first instincts were, wow, that language, or Italian, or Spanish, it sounds so beautiful, as compared to German, which just frankly doesn't sound very beautiful unless you have some kind of twisted Mr. Tonkovich kind of sense of aesthetics. I do as well, by the way. I think German is a beautiful language, but let's just be fair. Romance languages, what? Roll off the tongue, we say. The French are very proud of their language. They say about this language to Mr. Batson, it's a pretty disgusting language that they speak, and they smell when they speak it, because they never bathe. To which Mr. Batson comes back and says, okay, look, come on, there's got to be another source. To which the circulation agent will say, one of the last places that you can go is this chap named Chaucer. Chaucer will tell us about the people of 1350. But here's the deal. Chaucer had to make a choice about what language he would write in. Let's list the possibilities for him. One, he could have written in Italian. I told you he's fluent. He could have written in Italian and rivaled Boccaccio's Decameron. He could have. And it would have probably been a bestseller because there was always that marketplace that had already been kind of broken in Italy. And he could have written it and published it in Italy. People would have enjoyed reading it. But he wanted to write in England. Option two, he could write in French. He was educated and could write in French, but here's the problem. He wanted to make fun of the French and the people in power, and if you're writing in the language of the people you're making fun of and nobody else can read it, it's not going to last very long. Leads him to the third option. He could write in Latin. I told you the chap's intelligent. He could write in Latin. Latin, of course, is the language of the church. Right? For example, when you go to church, and let's point out, everyone goes to church in 1350. And that church is just one church. Let's make sure we all understand this. This is the Roman Catholic Church, and that's the church you go to in 1350. Nobody's allowed to wake up on Sunday morning and go, no, I don't think I'm going today. Way wrong answer. Excommunication is the promise. And of course, that's bad news. So everybody goes. And when they go, they listen in Latin, but nobody understands Latin. It's not like the normal people understand Latin. They just kind of sit there and they go through the process of listening to the liturgy and the Mass being spoken in Latin. He says, Chaucer, I could write it in Latin, but I want to make fun of the church as well. I mean, obviously, if you write in the language, ultimately he chooses to write in a language that point didn't have an orthography that was standardized yet, a spelling that was standardized. It didn't have a grammar that was standardized. He writes in the language of these English people. And in so doing, in so choosing to do this, he ostensibly invents the orthography and the spelling of English language in its written form. Now, the reason why Chaucer today is so respected and studied by classic language scholars, linguistics, is that his spelling of the words tell us kind of how they spoke those words. The beautiful thing for Chaucer is there's no dictionary. So he can spell the same word 4 different ways. It's okay, he just spells it the way it sounds at the time. For those of us who are bad spellers, that would be a great freedom, wouldn't it, right? To be able to just spell the word the way it sounds, okay? He's got no sense of grammar and he doesn't worry about it. He basically tries to just recapitulate the language, the rhythms of the language as he has heard it spoken for much of his professional life, working at one of these gates at London. Okay? Now, in the process of doing this, he obviously is building on English that was already, as we understand it, beginning to be amalgamated or brought together 400 years prior. Remember Beowulf. Remember, we looked at the language of Old English. I think it was who? Mr. Schreiber tried to read for us those words, and we had to admit it was a fine attempt. But if you were to read that to an outsider, that outsider would absolutely be certain that what Schreiber was reading was some kind of foreign language. No, he was reading English. We'll call it Old English. Look at your handout. Mr. Schreiber now gets a chance to redeem himself. What? See, he's excited. And we're going to ask him to read the first 5 or 6 lines of this one. Now, here's the deal. We're reading English. We're reading what we call Chaucer's English, okay? We're reading what we call Middle English. By the way, for your notes, when we read Shakespeare 200 years later, okay, here we're working roughly 1400. Hamlet, 1600. So you can kind of think about it. At 1600, Shakespeare's writing Hamlet. We're 600 years after Beowulf and the attempt by Mr. Schreiber to read Old English. So you can already see how 400 years later, to be honest, are you ready for this? This handout comes from the high school anthology that I taught from when I first arrived at Worland High School more than a year or two ago. My AP students loathed the fact that they had to read all of the general prologue in Middle English. I did not provide them with translation, and there was no net at the time for them to go and find a translation. It took them about 3 pages, and then they started to figure it out. And then it became like a game of sorts, and it became kind of a fun game actually after a while. And then they got to where they could read it pretty quickly. You're reading English that you'll be able to you'll be able to tell it's English. You'll see enough words, that kind of thing. Take a look at how Mr. Schreiber attempts it. Go ahead. And Mr. Schreiber, by the way, has had no ability to practice, so he's going to stumble. Go ahead.
When that April with his shore suit the drought of March hath pursed to the root, and bathed every vein in switch liquor, of which virtue engendered is the flower, when Zephyrus eke with his sweet breath inspired hath in every holt and heath, in tender crops and the young sown, hath in the ram his half-course Iron.
You can kind of tell, see, sown and roan rhyme. So let's right away put this on our notes. Chaucer is writing poetry. This is why we often will call him one of the greatest poets of all time as well. I'm telling you, you can't invent enough accolades for this guy because of the influence that he will have. By the way, just notice the 2 words that Mr. Schreiber was working with. Sown and roan over time will become sun, S-U-N, and run, won't it? Right? Okay? Which is to say, words that rhyme, yes? Now, by the way, let's give Mr. Schreiber a hand. I mean, he, for a second time now, let's go ahead, give him a hand. Well done, well done. He of course, attempted now Middle English, which will mean that when we hit Hamlet here in a few days, he'll be ready to read the opening, and then he'll have made the full circle, you see, from Old English to Middle English to what we will call as Shakespeare Modern English, when in 9th grade, you picked up R&J, Romeo and Juliet, and you started reading it, 2 households, both alike in dignity, and fair Verona, where we lay our scene. You were reading the very words Shakespeare wrote. There's no translator that's going to come in after the fact and kind of tweak the words so that you can understand it. Notice on page 140, you are working with translation, and now, of course, we'll have the rendering of what Mr. Schreiber was, if not reading, stumbling through at least. When in April, by the way, the first 20 lines or so, we call it the first 18 lines, is the opening lines, right, of the general prologue of Canterbury Tales. By the way, these lines are often required memorization for students. We'll not ask you to do that, but I want to point out that this is a when, then construction. So watch this, okay? As Chaucer sets up his Canterbury Tales, look at how he plays the game. When in April, what time of the year? Spring, good. The sweet showers fall and pierce the drought of March to the root, and all the veins are bathed in liquor of such power as brings about the engendering of the flower. See, if you're working with your annotative notes, notice the first when. In the spring, when what? How would you put it in your own words? In the spring, when what? When it starts raining, right, and we get flowers. These basically the opening lines of the Bambi film, right? For those of you that know about Twitter painting in the spring. When also, line 5, notice the second when also Zephyrus with his sweet breath exhales an air in every grove and heath upon the tender shoots, and the young sun his half course and the sign of the ram has run. In other words, what? What's the second when? How would you use your sidebar to help you with this one, by the way? What's he saying here? What is Zephyrus? Do we understand? What's that one, Mr. Kelleher? What are we talking about? Wind. Yeah, the spring wind, in other words. So, for example, when the spring happens, rain, that spring breeze that begins to bring about the engendering of the flower. Notice the next one. And the small fowl are making melody that sleep away the night with open eye. How do you sleep away the night with open eye? What does that mean?
Close your eyes when you sleep.
What's going on in the evening if you're sleeping with your eyes open? Right, you're not sleeping. So what are you doing in the nighttime if you're not sleeping with open eye? And who is it that's Hanky Panky? This is, of course, our Bambi Twitter painting thing, right? Yes. In other words, in the spring, when all of the little flowers and animals, especially rabbits and the like, remember your Bambi scene, all become Twitter painted and everything starts Hanky Pankying around. By the way, notice the parenthetic. So nature pricks them and their heart engages. In other words, why is it that animals all Hanky Panky in the spring? Because that's the way God intended it. Let's just, for your notes, point out, there's going to be a lot of hanky-pankying that goes on in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It's funny that today, students are thoroughly convinced MTV invented the notion of spring break and the debauchery that goes on. Of course, if you're at all familiar with what the Greeks did in the spring, they invented spring break. They called it the Dionysian festival. And of course, they kind of invented the concept of the, celebrated religious orgy and all of that. We're going to be told here that the English play a similar kind of game in the spring, only they call it a pilgrimage, where they get to go for their church outing in the spring, you see. So you can already see Chaucer's going to begin to play a little bit of a game. Let's keep going. So nature pricks them and their heart engages. Then people long to go on pilgrimages, and palmers long to seek the stranger strands of far-off saints hallowed in sundry lands, and specially from every shire's end of England down to Canterbury they wend to seek the holy blissful martyr quick to give his help to them when they were sick. So the opening lines, notice a when, then kind of construction. When in the spring in April, you have the rain, you have the breeze, you have nature pricking, of course, wanting to create more species or whatever, hanky-pankying is going on. When all of that happens, Chaucer tells us, the English people of 1350 like to go to this place called Canterbury for a sacred or holy journey or a pilgrimage. Now, right away, Mr. Batson's already being given some important information that, quite frankly, he didn't learn from as much from his other readings. These people are, can I do this with my fingers like this? Devoutly religious. Now, what we mean when we say devoutly religious will become, of course, one of the jokes, right, puns of Canterbury Tales, all right? In other words, it's an excuse in the spring to go on a little trip where you get to have a little bit of fun, because Canterbury, while being a devoutly religious town, also has a whole bunch of bars and that kind of thing. When you're not praying, you got to be doing something else. You see how this works. Speaking of bars, by the way, it gets better or worse depending on There's a reason why. A few years ago, a devoutly religious individual in this community walked up to me and said, "Are you still teaching that Chaucer?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I enjoy it. You know, that stuff is obscene and pornography. You shouldn't be teaching it to young students." And I said, "I understand where you're coming from. And there's a reason why devoutly religious people still can be very offended by the project I told you we were going to call Chaucer's Project." Let's get into it. Notice what he says. It happened. So Chaucer is going to frame what goes on as an event that actually transpired in his own life. It happened in that season, that one day, in Southward, at the Tabard, as I lay ready to go on pilgrimage and start for Canterbury, most devout at heart, at night there came into that hostelry some 9 and 20 in a company of sundry folk, happening then to fall in fellowship, and they were pilgrims all that towards Canterbury meant to ride. Now, notice where he says he was. Did you see the title of the little inn where he was? It's a tavern. Yeah, it's a tavern. Now, it's right next to another place called the Bell. Let's go ahead and now say this in your notes, and this is the kind of intel they don't give you in high school anthologies that I think is very significant. The Tavern and the Bell, by the way, still are visited spots in London. They, of course, became famous because of the reference here. The Bell is the famous, one of the famous houses of prostitution. The Tabard is, of course, the tavern right next door. Notice Chaucer. I was at the whorehouse getting ready to go on pilgrimage when into the bar came a number of people who were also going on pilgrimage to Canterbury. Notice he says, most devout at heart. right? Most devout. I was praying hard that night when these people all showed up. There's going to be double and triple entendre. That is to say, language that has double and triple meaning. And this is what we will reference as Chaucer's satire. Now let's talk about satire for a moment. Chaucer doesn't invent satire. If I could go to 146, by the way. Chaucer doesn't invent satire, but he builds on a history. Now there's two kinds of satire that's really important in Roman history. There's a guy named Juvenal who wrote satire. We call that kind of satire Juvenalian. And there's a guy named Horace who wrote satire, and we call that Horatian satire. Horatian satire for the Romans is kind of like gentle satire when you make fun of somebody and they enjoy it and they laugh too. Juvenalian satire is vicious or mean satire. That's when you say something and the person who's being made fun of does not laugh. Maybe other people laugh, but it's in a vicious, mean way. Juvenal is far more mean in his satire. Chaucer's familiar with both, and Chaucer will play the game of both, Juvenalian as well as Horatian satire. Now, what is satire? Say one thing, mean something else. So, for example, you're out on a date, and it's going terrible, and somebody asks you, how's it going? And you say, oh, this is just great, the best date of my life. And it's fairly evident that what you're saying is, this is like the most wretched experience I could imagine. In other words, you say one thing, you mean something else. Satire always involved with as well irony. Irony. Now, tomorrow I'm going to begin my lecture by pointing out the conservative element of satire and comedy itself. So when we come back tomorrow, we'll begin on page 146 and we'll hear the first example of Chaucer's biting wit. Thank you.